Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're viewing this live stream. I guess the silver lining of a virtual event is that we have a much larger global audience. So welcome to you all. My name is Shabnam Nasimi, and I am the Executive Director of the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan. And we're honored to have with us today Ambassador Roland Kobia, who has been appointed as the EU Special Envoy for Afghanistan since 2017. And he specializes for the last 18 years in conflict countries, political and economic transitions, peace processes, reconciliation, national security, and state building. We're also happy to have Fawzia Kofi, who's a member of the Afghanistan peace negotiation team. She was the elected member of Parliament for Badakhshan in September 2005 and elected as the first woman to be the second Deputy Speaker of Parliament in Afghanistan's history. We also have Mr. Khalid Noor, who has actively participated in various peace talks initiated in Moscow, Pakistan, and Qatar, and has become the youngest member of Afghanistan's peace negotiation team. Mr. Siddiqui, who is experiencing a bit of an internet problem at the moment, but will be joining us shortly, is the spokesperson for the President of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. He has advised the government on security strategies and policies for public diplomacy, reforms related to rule of law, counterinsurgencies, and counter-terrorism. We're also honored to have Dr. Thomas Barfield, who's a leading social anthropologist and who has conducted extensive research on Afghanistan. He's currently the professor of anthropology and the director of Institute for the Study of Muslim Societies and Civilization at Boston University, and has served as the president of the American Institute for Afghanistan Studies since 2005. And last but not least, we have Sultan Barakat, who's a director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and a professor in politics and post-war recovery studies at the University of York. He's had over 25 years of professional experience working on issues of conflict management, humanitarian response, and post-conflict recovery and transition. After the opening remarks, we will have a Q&A session moderated by Michael Kugelman, the Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. And we invite you to take part in today's event by asking questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens or the comment section. And you can also engage with us and each other using today's hashtag #AfghanistanPeace. Let me begin by introducing the Conservative Friends of Afghanistan, which is an influential British lobby group based in London and supported by a wide range of British parliamentarians. Our mission is to provide independent analysis and engage in campaigning, advocacy, policy work, and lobbying to improve Afghanistan's complex context and propose new mechanisms and solutions. And we aim to provide a fair representation for the needs of the people of Afghanistan and develop innovative narratives to create a more positive and democratic future for the country. UK's foreign policy on Afghanistan is one of the core tenets of CFA's priorities, and we're widely known as the leading political group led by Afghan diaspora in the UK in working to inspire change and progress in Afghanistan. At CFA, supporting a sustainable peace process has been a core focus of our work. Nearly 5 months ago, 5 months have passed since the signing of the agreement between the US and the Taliban, an agreement that was meant to create a pathway for formal peace talks known as the Intra-Afghan dialogue between the Taliban and the Afghan government. However, while that agreement called for a launch of the Intra-Afghan dialogue within a period of 10 days, talks remain elusive today. The long delay is all the more striking given that a series of major obstacles to peace talks, including the long-running spat between the President Ashraf Ghani and his main rival, Dr. Abdullah, as well as a disagreement over Taliban prisoner release, has now been overcome. And while each side has signaled commitment to the intra-Afghan dialogue and the venue in Doha it has been announced, the talks remain elusive. And one of the key barriers now is the issue of violence, which has been rising to unprecedented levels, including at increasing and quite disturbing numbers of civilian capacities. While the U.S. Taliban agreement stipulated that insurgents scale down attacks on U.S. targets in Afghanistan, it did not require the Taliban to ease up on attacks on Afghan targets. And in recent weeks, the Taliban have scaled up its violence and has refused to agree to a reduction, or much less a ceasefire. Disappointingly, in advance of the expected talks, the Taliban have unleashed, as I mentioned, a high level of violence. And in the last week, they've launched 284 attacks covering half the country's provinces. In Kabul, where residents have recently experienced multiple bomb blasts, fear for personal securities have soared. And prisoner releases that were expected to set long-awaited intra-Afghan dialogue in motion have instead proved a roadblock and a display of Taliban inflexibility. There are also disturbing reports that among the more than 4,000 prisoners freed so far, some have already violated an agreement not to return to the field. And so trust in the Taliban has also suffered. Last week, when humanitarian observers reported that contrary to claims, Taliban-controlled areas have changed very little from the past social and governing practices. And following these obstacles, the struggle to launch the dialogue has also meant that the withdrawal of the U.S. troops has impacted the Afghanistan in a huge way. According to the deal, all U.S. Forces must be out of Afghanistan by spring 2021, which is already in motion. Recently, in recent days, U.S. forces have departed from several Afghan military bases. And as the Trump administration prepares for further drawback in troops from Afghanistan, there are fears in Kabul that the Taliban are waiting out the Americans before showing their true colors. And if the U.S. Troop withdrawal continues to a pace, even as the war continues to rage, rapid destabilization in Afghanistan is a very strong possibility. And there are also other troubles. COVID-19 has exacerbated the struggles that Afghans face, including contributing to the increased food insecurity and extreme poverty. And so after 20 years of American, British, and international presence, billions in aid, and thousands of lives sacrificed, the country is at risk of falling back in the hands of the Taliban, a group that has moved from an enemy in the battlefield to a partner in a peace process. And the people of Afghanistan have very openly expressed that they will not compromise at the expense of the achievements of the people of the country and the fundamental rights that Afghanistan has gained over the last 20 years. And so with reports indicating that talks between Afghanistan and the Taliban could begin, again, it's uncertain, but it could begin during the coming weeks, today's discussion could not come at a better time. So we look forward to hearing more from our distinguished panelists on some of the key areas that I've highlighted in the context of the situation. But we'll begin by inviting each speaker to provide an opening remark, and then that will be followed by some Q&A. So I guess I will turn firstly to Ms. Fawzia Koofi for your opening keynote.
Thank you, Ms. Naseem, and it's great to see friends of Afghanistan, people who have stood by us and our people during very difficult times, and they continue to do so. There is a say when people say that peace makes prisoners presidents, and we have seen that in the history of the world. Conflicts. When it comes to the peace process in Afghanistan, or the question of bringing peace to the people of Afghanistan who have faced conflicts and violence almost my age, and definitely more than most of your people who are from Afghanistan or who have a background of being Afghan, most of your ages. So definitely, peace is not only a desire, but it's a need for people of Afghanistan. peace has not only taken many lives, and when I talk about war has not taken many lives only. When I talk about lives, I'm referring to more than 2 million people that have been killed in over 4 decades of war. But it has also taken a lot of opportunities. Right now, there are 3 million Afghan children who are supposed to be in school, but they are not because of the war. Around more than 2 million people are internally displaced because of the conflicts and as a consequence of that. The economic impact of the war is something that we do not bring usually to our discussions, but Afghanistan is a country which 52% of its population live under poverty and multidimensional poverty. If you look at the women, for instance, education, Afghan women started going to medical college at the same year where women in Turkey, for instance, started, 1975. Look where I'm not talking politically, but where the Turkish women are in terms of their education, but Afghan women, only 30% of Afghan women are able to, are literated basically. Maternal mortality. I don't want to portray a very negative picture, but maternal mortality in Afghanistan is unfortunately one of the highest countries for maternal mortality. Some of it has got to do with history and tradition, but most of it has got to do with war and a consequence of war. So we're not just talking about the number of people that are killed on a daily basis and the number of mothers and sisters and brothers and fathers who are exposed to mourning every day for losing their loved ones. But we're also talking about a country which is so rich in terms of natural resources, which is so rich in terms of its important geographical location, connecting Central Asia to South Asia, but has been so deprived of all of that opportunity. And therefore, we want to and we need to pave the way for a peace. But now the question is, what kind of peace and with what cost? I think a lot of people keep saying that gains of over more than 20 years post-2000 Taliban should be preserved. But what I think is we need a peace where every Afghan will have a chance of using one vote for the future of their country, regardless of their gender, regardless of their religious belief, regardless of their ethnic affiliation, whatever. Every Afghan living in this geography will have the opportunity to use their votes, one person, one vote. That is an Afghanistan where I think, and they use it without fear, without violence, without the fear of being beaten up or being attacked or suicide bombing. That is an Afghanistan we all strive for. And therefore, I think it's a time for the Taliban. It's a time for all of us to leave what we have done so far, violence. You see, in Afghanistan, every day, people are killed. And I'm not talking about those who are killed in the battlefield. I'm talking about those who are killed in the hospitals during delivery, who are killed in the going on the way to school, children who are killed in the while playing. And these are just figures for all of us, but these are not just figures for their families, for those who are losing their loved ones. So for the sake of all of this, I think it's time for us to get together. And the good thing is there is a political consensus nationally and internationally in Afghanistan for pursuing the peace and making sure that Afghan people of my generation, the younger generation, at least see a peaceful life once in their lifetime. Shabnam John, I cannot hear you. I stop here. I think you're muted. I will definitely be happy to take some questions and more comments.
Thank you, Ms. Fawzia. for that very passionate opening remark, and hopefully we will see peace in Afghanistan with the presence of very passionate women like yourself in the negotiation team. I will turn to Mr. Khalid Noor for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nasimi. It's great to be in this panel and with great friends of Afghanistan. And I have met some of them after a long time. Let me just briefly explain, just mention some of the most important issues about war and peace in Afghanistan. This war in Afghanistan have been for last four decades, and we have been suffering for generations. And this war has two roots. We have a national, internal, and as well as international roots. And the internal roots of this conflict is deeply affected by the international policies and factors. For example, we have had international terrorism in this country. We have had a lot of interference from the regional countries as well as neighboring countries. And of course, recently in the last post 2001, we have had this international coalition against terrorism and radicalism. So as a result of these events, we, the Afghan people, have been the victims of this war. And my people are fighting not just for Afghanistan's peace, but also for the security of the region and the international community. We have fought against Al-Qaeda, who are still a threat to the international community. And this war have not just been about security, it's about our values, it's about our beliefs. We have been fighting for a pluralism society where there is social justice, where there is human rights, women's rights, the rights of minorities, and a government and a democratic government where our leaders are elected by our people. And of course, the same goes with peace. It also has two factors. We have internal and international factors. Our internal actors would be the Republic of Afghanistan, which has the government and of course political parties, civil society. And on the other side, we have the Taliban, insurgency, and as well as other terrorist groups. With the international actors, of course, it's the United States and the Western allies, as well as regional and neighboring countries. Now, with these in mind, we see this peace process is an opportunity, and there are a few things that make us optimistic about the peace process. There is a national consensus for peace in Afghanistan among our people, among our politicians and government. Everyone is striving for a peaceful Afghanistan. I am the third generation of my family, at least, that have been born and raised in this war. So we say that we deserve peace now in Afghanistan. And also the international community, they support this peace process. And we have all come to understand that the war in Afghanistan have hit a deadlock. There is no winner in war, and no one can win this war through force. But negotiation is the only best option that we can have to find a now the challenge, of course, challenges, and also there's one thing I have to mention here for the other side, the Taliban. They have to know that there's a new Afghanistan now. There is a new society that has been formed post 9/11. We have a government, we have a constitution, we have strong institutions and security forces. We have gained a lot of rights in the last 19 years, and that the Taliban shall not expect to come to Afghanistan the way they did in 1996. It's not acceptable for the people of Afghanistan and for the society. They will reject it. Now, the challenges, of course, there is one of the most important one is that there are some ideas, some intentions for a quick fix. We shall not be looking for a quick fix for this complicated and complex conflict and war. And also, there is a lack of trust between the parties. We have not seen any commitment from the Taliban side. They have not kept they haven't been able to keep their promises. The level of violence have been increasing quite significantly in the last few weeks. And this it will damage the trust of the Afghan people on the peace process, not just the peace process, but on the Taliban. And we will question their honesty. And it is very important to be committed to our promises and to build that trust, not to destroy the trust that we have at this point. I'm hoping and I'm advocating for a free and fair Afghanistan where everyone will have an equal right, equal opportunity, where there is social justice and where there is rights for everyone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khalid Noor, for that very, again, passionate remark on the peace process. And thankfully, Mr. Sadiq Siddiqui has finally been able to join us. So I'll move on to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, everyone, to all participants, to Mr. Noor, to Mr. Al-Barakat, to Mr. Thomas, and Madame Fawzia Kufi, and I hope you're having a good evening. Yeah, the question was, is peace possible? So I would like to comment on the outset about the possibility and how we envision peace as a process and as a desire. Peace is possible, of course, if we have a solid regional and a global consensus on the desired end state. And the end state we see is a sovereign, democratic, and united Afghanistan at peace within, and of course, and in peace with the regional countries, and to preserve and expand the gains of the past 19 years, which we endured, and a very strong partnership with the international community. For the first time in the history of Afghanistan, we are still having a long and sustainable partnership with global community based on values that we all agree. Of course, human rights, the women's issue and children issue, and the peace as not only for Afghans, but also for the region. Afghanistan today has the capacity and the political will to end violence, to concluding a political agreement whereby the Taliban can participate in the government and seek to achieve their political goals through meaningful and based on the rules of the Constitution, or participate through elections in the future. That capacity within the Afghan society and of course the political will is there, and also the Taliban as a group, if they are seeking political goals, so the first thing is they have to abandon violence. Our peace has to move from a desirable goal to a process with clear objectives in which we can agree. So the first will be to end violence, and the second will be to have a sustainable peace in which Afghan people and global community can see a stable Afghanistan in the future. at the moment, as we all know, there is a very strong regional and global consensus to support this process. But of course, I will not say that we are yet there to achieve our goal. It's going to be a very long process. It's going to be a very difficult process. And it will be very hard for all of us to convince the Taliban to abandon violence and tell them to come onto the table of discussion and talk. And we will have to see what are their demands. There are some caveats to these to this process. There's opportunities versus threats, and of course, the latest violence by the Taliban has created some deadlocks, which can undermine somehow the early stages of this process. But on the other hand, when you look at the actions of the Afghan government that have not been yet reciprocated by the Taliban are immense to forge not only internally but globally and regionally to bring peace to Afghanistan. I will stop here, and then I would love to see some questions and remarks, and then I would comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Siddiqui. And I completely agree. Violence needs to end for any sort of peace or negotiation to actually begin. I'll move on to Ambassador Roland, if that's all right, for your opening remarks.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for the good initiative. And as you say, very timely, and for the invitation. Look, a few general remarks first. The first one is that we are all trying to work on the Afghan peace process, but it is very important not to lose sight of the big picture and the long-term scenario. As it was just said, this will be long, and we need to avoid the tendency to have the nose on the steering wheel of short-term considerations. The Afghan peace should not be driven by short-term objectives or just processes. Just as it must be driven by the interest of Afghans and of Afghanistan and of the region, and not by the own political considerations of those involved, number one. Number two, peace should not be at any cost, and I think other speakers have referred to that. Peace is not merely the absence of war. It is a very complex objective that will need to bring many different aspects together. And I think it is important in this regard that the Taliban gradually move from an insurgent to a political act. Three, peace also needs a spirit of peace that goes beyond what is the case now. It is very exegetical interpretations of agreements, very strict interpretations, which is what we witness for the time being. We see a lot of semantics, and we see actually little concrete behavior, spirit, that shows a dedication to peace, that shows an outlook and a strategy that honors the sacrifices made by the Afghans. So these are a few reasons why the EU has taken very consistently this principled and values-based position with pragmatism. We are not dogmatic, we are not naive, but nevertheless around key principles that need to remain. I just would like to make a very short summary of the track record of where we stand after the Doha. I think the US has spared no effort to try and generally implement the Doha agreement. 5 US bases have been closed. The US and NATO troops have been reduced in proportional numbers according to the planning and even before day 135. NATO and ANSDF refrained from military action for many weeks after Doha. There has been the release of thousands of Taliban prisoners since Doha, when actually the government was neither a party to the agreement nor in the room to impact it. That is a major confidence building measure. Another thing was the renewal of UN Security Council waivers. Another one is the offer of consensus of the international community to support peace. So a lot has been done in a few months. What has happened on the Taliban side? Well, there have been less attacks on big cities, that is true. But there has been a continued and unacceptable high violence, notably on civilians. Horrific terrorist attacks on maternity, mosques, moderate imams, and other civilian targets. We have also seen a stubborn refusal of a ceasefire called by all Afghans, by the UN and by the whole international community, apart from very, very few exceptions. We have received no real explanation from the Taliban why they remain deaf to the call of the whole world. I honestly do not know. We have all our interpretations, but we have heard no explanation. So I think the reduction in violence, this concept that has come very prominently, has shown its limits. And it is now used to justify the continuation of undue violence. The only thing that we should talk about now is a ceasefire. On the release of prisoners, what happened? Well, the Taliban have indeed released several hundreds of military, police, some say also some civilians in there, but not yet all of them, even if the 1,000 target is much less than the 5,000 target that they expect from the government. So a lot of energy has been put on the release of prisoners in a rather inflexible and again exegetic and dogmatic way, because let's recall that the Doha Agreement says that it must be up to 5,000 prisoners, not 5,000, and not a precise list. So if we want to stick to 100% to a list that comprises people that have committed war crimes, this is very difficult. Finally, the Taliban have yet to show concrete results on severing links with terrorist groups, as major attacks have continued. And there has been, I think, much too little condemnation of these attacks if they have been perpetrated by other groups. So I think everyone is accountable for its actions. And the more the situation will be made difficult now, the more complicated for the people of Afghanistan to turn the page of war. One just cannot carry on killing and expecting that it will easily get away with that. I will finish with some of the guiding principles that we are trying to keep in this very difficult process. The first one is conditionality. The peace process must be conditions-based, and all European capitals agree 100% with the US on this. This is not me saying this. These are the 27 foreign ministers of the EU that a few weeks ago have made it unambiguously clear that the EU will continue to support Afghanistan politically and financially, but not unconditionally. The EU will not be in a position to support a political vision or a future administration that departs from the Republican values, from the political and social gains, from the fundamental rights, rights of women, youth, minority groups, etc. So we do not want to impose anything on Afghans. It is Afghans that need to decide freely for what political model they wish. But if our help is requested, as it has already been the case by both parties, well, then we have the right to assess whether we can help or not. And we have the right to put our opinion. Our public opinion, our taxpayers, our parliaments will never accept that we support or even finance a country where there's a regime of the like we have known in the past. The second principle is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. This US commitment is very important and needs to be upheld strictly. The Doha deal is a package where all components are intimately linked together. Number three, we are also demanding with the government. We try to remain impartial. We are not neutral. I very often hear from the Taliban that the EU should be neutral. We are not neutral. We are a political body, but we try to remain impartial. From the government, we would like that peace be at the center of things rather than political games. The Afghan people does not have the luxury to wait for all that. There needs also to be more women in both negotiating teams at real position of responsibility. And there also needs to show more efficiency to the people in actions and the constitution of a new government without any delay. The third or fourth, I don't know, principle is that to ensure that the peace process will work, I think there needs to be a strong pedagogy and understanding of how diplomacy and politics work. And I think our friends in Doha have a very important role in this. It must be understood that Doha is a bilateral agreement between the Taliban and the US. It has been a very important step, needed, but there are only two signatories. While we support all the efforts towards peace, the Taliban should understand that while one can support an agreement, No one has ever been bound by an agreement that it either not signed or that it did not negotiate. And my final point is on the spirit of the peace process. If one is truly interested in a peace process, and that is what we hear from the Taliban, from the government, from everyone, then one should act with moderation and openness. We do not see this for the time being. It is mainly about turf, power, intimidation, etc. We see a lot of stubbornness. We see an uncompromising attitude. You know, the fight and talk has been tested. Now is the moment for the intra-Afghan negotiations to start and to concentrate on the talk, not on the fight. This has not been tried yet, so let's try it. And if you allow me, I will finish with this quote of old philosopher Thucydides, which I think should be reflected by many people involved in the peace process when he said 2,500 years ago, but it's still very modern. He said, of all manifestations of power, it is moderation that impresses the most. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rowland. That was incredibly detailed, and hopefully a little bit more discussion in the Q&A to just address a few of the points that you mentioned. I'll swiftly move on to Dr. Thomas Barfield to provide his input.
Thank you for organizing this. I would like to focus first on the fact that this was a bilateral agreement between the United States and the Taliban, but also speaking as an American would note that many Americans don't always see the Trump administration as reflecting American values. And we have an election coming up in 4 months. We often talk about political instability in places like Afghanistan, but at the moment, I think it's very difficult for our Afghan friends to decide which side the US is on, because if one looks at the Congress, one sees a very strong backing for policies of maintaining support for Afghanistan, for holding the values. And many of us look at the agreement with the Taliban more as a fig leaf that Trump could declare a victory by getting out. And if you get into the microcosms of American politics, it's not up to Trump. Trump may say that he has all the powers, but if one looks at who sets policy and money in Afghanistan, it's the Congress of the United States. And also recently, given his difficulties with the American military, it is not clear that the American military is willing to go below what they're currently pulling out, which is pretty close to, we have to remember that President Obama promised to get down to 0 and changed his mind. We have a president possibility coming up that certainly isn't interested, Joe Biden, in, and wasn't interested. He was opposed to the surge during the Obama administration, but he has talked about an enduring commitment to Afghanistan at a low level. He was more of an anti-terrorist sort of force. So at the moment, I think one of the great difficulties of any Afghan peace process is you're not sure which side America is on because America hasn't yet chosen a side. And that's not going to clear up for probably 4 months. And there could be substantial changes in that policy. So it's very difficult, I would say, to some extent, I think the Taliban, assuming that the Trump administration represents an American desire to get out at all costs, actually misinterprets the support for Afghanistan in the United States. Afghanistan, unlike Iraq, has never been politicized in the United States. It's always had bipartisan support. People have been disappointed that it's gone on for 20 years, but it was not an issue in the last election. It will not be an issue in this election. There's many other issues in the United States right now that put Afghanistan in the shade. So it's really important in terms for Afghans to look at this, of understanding that they need to focus on their own interests right now. And if this gives an opportunity for an internal dialogue between Afghans on the Taliban side and on the other side, that should be taken advantage of, because this is something that's been lacking. And if the Doha agreement merely opens a line of exchange for a serious talk between Afghans, I think it's worthwhile. But I don't think at any point that actually we're in even the beginning of a peace agreement. But another thing, and turning the Taliban have certainly, I really doubt, not necessarily those in Doha, but as a movement that they have, that they still believe they can win. And the history of Afghan insurgency is as such that Afghan insurgencies have driven foreigners out of Afghanistan 4 times in the past 175 years. No insurgency has ever come to power as long as a major power stood behind the Kabul government. And I certainly thought the Najibullah regime would fall when the Soviets pulled out, and it didn't. So one of the things that the Taliban should realize is they're in a great negotiating position right now, but they're not in a wonderful military position. You can hold all the rural regions of Afghanistan that you want, but you're not going to be able to gear up to take the country. So you're better off negotiating now with a perceived strength on the political side, because militarily you can't really follow through. They run a great insurgency. They can't put an army in the field. And even if the Americans pull out all of their planes and troops, they can leave enough drones behind so the Taliban can never crawl out of the countryside. So that's just an important thing to look at. But I think the more important thing is this gives an opportunity to test what the Taliban is up to, but also I think for the Afghan side to realize when we talk about participating in an Afghan government, we have not seen much participation in the Kabul government. What we have seen is a zero-sum game. Whoever gets the presidency runs the place. And the national unity government did not show a whole lot of national unity. So one of the questions I was Taliban, if you were saying participate in the political process, I would say the people sitting on your side of the table have participated on the political process and have been unable to have their positions represented. Why does Afghanistan still have no legal recognition of political parties? How can you run a democracy without having a political parties law? And this goes all the way back to Zahir Shah refused to do it, and we have the current administrations refusing to do it. How can the Taliban participate as a political party if political parties cannot run their own slates of candidates and organize parliament on that basis? How can they participate in a government essentially that the executive, based on the 2004 Constitution, which is based on the 64 Constitution, gives the president of Afghanistan kingly powers? I think that when we talk about that the Taliban must accept the Afghan Constitution, what we should really talk about is the principles of that Constitution. That Constitution, in terms of how it actually runs governance, is very flawed, but it has very important principles. And I think this would be an opportunity to say, how do we get a fairer Afghanistan that would include not only participation of the Taliban on a political basis, but the participation of all groups for Afghanistan. This is a chance to move out of what has been an unfortunate tradition in Afghanistan of Afghan autocracy. And whether that's been Taliban, communist, or democratically elected presidents, it is still too strong to allow people to put their trust in sharing power when power has never been shared in Afghanistan. So there has to be, I believe, confidence building mechanisms on the Kabul side to show that it's willing to share power, to give an example to the Taliban that this political process is where your interests could take place. So I think it's an opportunity precisely because the world is busy with other things at the moment for Afghans to get together to say, we live here, we should decide our future. And so let's sit down. What are the basic points for all of us? What are the non-negotiable positions, particularly on the Afghan side in terms of human rights, women's rights, to get the Taliban to recognize this is a new Afghanistan. It's not the Afghanistan they left. It's not the Afghanistan of 100 years ago. So this is an opportunity, I think, for a very, very productive discussion. It may not immediately lead to peace, but it should have a debate that goes beyond a bilateral debate, but it involves all of Afghanistan as to how do we get a political process that all Afghans can participate in and have confidence in.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barfield. And I will again move to Sultan Barakat so that we can get into the questions and answers. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all those who spoke ahead of me. I very much agree with Fawzia's Kofi's proposition about the fact that really Afghans have had enough of this war. And I think this should be the starting point for any discussion about peace in Afghanistan, is that this has gone for far too long, and people have paid a very high price to it. And not just the Afghans in Afghanistan, but also those who are still displaced outside the country in their millions, and those who are displaced within the country. I also think Khalid Noor's point about the fact that there is no other way but peace is very, very important. The fighting has been tried for many years. And we must remember that the United States invaded Afghanistan not at the request of the Afghans, and not for reasons to improve the life of Afghans. It came to Afghanistan for its own strategic reason, and it is now negotiating its exit from Afghanistan according to its own interest and its own strategic reasons. And I think the point raised by Mr. Sadiqi is that peace is possible. I think it's more than it's possible. I think this is the best opportunity that we've had for many, many years. And everyone should approach it from that perspective as well, that we've had enough, this is an opportunity, we must do our best to make it happen. Then what is it that we can do? I think to start with, all the third parties should really try and a little bit change their discourses and their position vis-a-vis all sides. You are now talking about trying to get two sides who do not agree with each other to come and work together. And as much as possible, we should really try and present the case in a balanced way in order to encourage both sides to remain engaged in this process. We have to understand also that both sides represent very different entities, very different positions, very different, they have very different perspectives on this conflict. And unfortunately, they also still have options. They may not have option to win the war, but they can have, and they do have option to extend this misery for many, many years to come. And it's the Afghans who have to pay the price at the end of the day. So in that sense, what is it that we should really try and do? I think where we are today, a great deal has been achieved. My colleagues, Kopje and Thomas, referred to the deal between the Americans and the Taliban as a bilateral deal, which it is exactly that. But it was also entangled into the intra-Afghan discussion. And for the deal to go beyond the 135 days, which actually was yesterday, I think, or today is the 135 day, there has to be progress on all fronts, including on the intra-Afghan government, and including having a government that is accepted by all, recognized, independent, sovereign, and united. And I think that's the position from all sides. Also for the United States cannot, and I suspect will not, hand over its bases to Taliban in Afghanistan, and will not hand it over to one side of the conflict. So they will have to have an army that is recognized and accepted by all sides, which calls for a government where there is a degree of power sharing. And I think Thomas has put his finger right on one of the issues about power sharing, but they're also important for the Taliban to understand that reality has changed in the country, that there has been a huge amount that has been gained, although ideally with the amount of money spent in Afghanistan and the way it was done, more should have been gained, but nevertheless, a lot has been done in the country. Someone has got to capture this and build on it. But also the other side should also understand that the world has changed. Nor the United States, not the United States, nor the European Union, nor any other country will be really willing in the current atmosphere to continue to spend the billions they're spending in the country on the basis of securing Afghanistan. So Afghans have got to secure their own country. And the best way to do it is to really reach an agreement amongst themselves. We saw for the last few months, the gaps when they created and enlarged between those sides can be exploited by other splinter groups, by other terrorist organizations. The rise of ISIS is very much a demonstration of that gap that exists between the government and the Taliban and other security forces. The closer they work together, the sooner they squeeze out those elements. at the risk of sounding as if I'm trying to defend one side, which I'm not, and I must make it very clear, I'm not really taking any position on any side. There has been one major obstacle since the 29th of February, which is the prisoners' exchange. I think there was a degree of naivety about how quickly this could happen. It was agreed on both sides in terms of the numbers in principle, and it was seen as something that can happen very, very quickly, which would then lead to the intra-Afghan talks, which would then lead to the ceasefire and the expanded level of negotiations. That unfortunately did not happen for many, many reasons. One of them was maybe sides were not prepared with their list. Identification of prisoners was not straightforward. There were attempts to include some criminals, some other prisoners in the exchange that were not recognized by one side or the other, and so on. So there were many reasons that led to this delay. And that stalled the start of the intra-Afghan talk. In addition to this, I think there has been a lot of noise internationally around those talks, not on the substance of the talks, which is very important, but on the superficial aspects of it. Where will it happen? What would be my interest as country A or country B? How can I pull those talks to my country? What will I gain from it, and so on? And that has again led to various delays. Now, these two are mostly behind us, and the numbers for the prisoners are very close to complete. There may be some that are still an issue between the two sides. All sides have agreed to meet in Doha, and I hope that the rest, including the regional countries and all those who support Afghanistan, will now lobby behind the two sides in as impartial as possible way in order to give birth to the new Afghanistan that is inclusive of everyone, including those who hold the ideology of, or closer ideologies to the Taliban. Everybody I spoke to agrees that Afghanistan has got to remain as an Islamic country. And I think nobody can negotiate over the fact that Islam is going to be at the core of whatever constitution is agreed. It's the makeup of this constitution, the arrangement for governance that needs to be worked out. And I think in the coming weeks and months, much more should be invested in working those technicalities. People need ideas. Even those who are negotiating need to have ideas being raised around them as to what would the constitution look like? What are the options? How does Indonesia manage? How does Malaysia manage? How does Iran run its affairs? Turkey as a model, Jordan, etc. We also need greater deal of discussion around issues of rights, women's role in society, how it doesn't conflict with Islam. They can't be more conservative in certain aspects than people in the Gulf are, including in Qatar where the talks are being held. But that doesn't stop women from participating fully in the system, in the state, in the education, etc., etc. And I think much more debates around those areas is required. And when we do this, we have to keep in mind the fact, which was pointed out by my colleagues earlier, that the Taliban have been outside the country for a long time, at least the political leadership, and life has changed. So someone has got to reintroduce a lot of these discussions to them. At the same time, I think it's really important that when we say it's going to be Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, we have to be true to that. So coming with more conditions from outside countries on what we expect to come out of these talks before they even met is probably counterproductive. And a lot of this conditionality, including in aid, Afghanistan has had a long experience with this from the days of the Taliban, during the Taliban, and after the Taliban. And those who follow this situation in detail would recognize a lot of what I'm talking about. I think it is important now that, that we are getting those people together, the two sides are getting together. Let's take a step back and help them focus on the substance of this debate, and hopefully it will move forward. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to all. This is Michael Kugelman. I was kindly given the opportunity by Shabnam to co-moderate this discussion. And so, first of all, I want to thank all 6 of you for 6 terrific presentations. It was a wonderful blend of comments from policymakers and academics. I certainly learned a lot. I imagine that much of the audience did. What I'm going to do right now is pose one question, a separate question to each of you. And I would ask that you keep your response brief to no more than 2 minutes, because we want to try to get to as many questions as we can. And so the first question, or the question that I will pose first, will go to Mr. Siddiqui. And it is as follows. The Taliban, as we've discussed, has not indicated a willingness to agree to reduce violence, much less a ceasefire, in advance of an intra-Afghan dialogue. Instead, it's demanded the continued release of Taliban prisoners. So would President Ghani be willing to begin negotiations without a reduction in violence or ceasefire commitment from the Taliban? And does the Afghan government remain committed to continuing to release Taliban prisoners even in the absence of a Taliban commitment to scale down violence? So, Mr. Siddiqui, that question is to you.
Thank you, Michael, for the question. I would keep it under 2 minutes. First of all, is the Afghanistan government commitment towards releasing up to 5,000 Taliban prisoners for the RIV, reduction in violence, and for the immediate start of the direct negotiation with the Taliban. So that's why after the 3 days ceasefire that we've had in 8 days, so the president decided to release immediately 2,000 of that 5,000. Although the Afghan government is not bound to any agreement that it has to release this number, which is a big number, and it's not a very popular decision to make, but it's a very courageous step to take for the peace process, which the president did that. So we are committed to release that 5,000 prisoners, of which 4,400 of them already released. The remaining 592, there's issue with their criminality, and of course our legal system and judiciary system does not allow us to release them because some of them are drug traffickers and they have this background. So, but we are committed to the number, yes. We are not committed to the names particularly, but to numbers, yes. We do not have any conditions for the start of the negotiation. We want to have this date for the negotiation as soon as possible, and we have called on the Taliban on many times, even if they do not reduce violence, even if they do not, abandon violence, we are still willing to go and sit with them so that we understand what are their demands and what are the demands of the Taliban for the future of Afghanistan. What do they want? What is the political agreement? What is the political process and settlement that they agree to? And what are their strategy in terms of, is it a zero-sum strategy to take over Afghanistan, or they want to be part of the new Afghanistan, which is the demand of the Afghan people? So I will stop here because I just crossed that 2 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think you did a great job of covering the question in that brief period of time. So now a question I want to direct to Ms. Kofi. Taliban leaders have been quite vague about how they would view the issue of women's rights if they were to hold power again. So in your view, what can be done, and what specifically would you plan to do as a member of the intra-Afghan negotiating team to try to gain some degree of assurance from the Taliban to safeguard women's rights? Did you hear? Are you there, Ms. Kofi?
I am, but I had to mute, unmute. Okay, so Michael, I just wanted to say that it is important for us to probably define or redefine this term of Taliban gaining power. because we're talking about a process where every Afghan, as I said before, will have a chance to participate in the political future of its country, including Taliban and people who are living under Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, regardless of their gender. So we're not talking about an Afghanistan where one part of the society will surrender itself to another part of the society, which is the Taliban in this case. And the Taliban should also realize that, that you cannot shake hands with a clenched fist, as they say. They have to really be flexible. Afghanistan today is represented by its diversity. That includes women, men. And I think, as one of the speakers said, the Taliban leadership, at least, who have lived abroad, not in Afghanistan, their children, their daughters in particular, have gone to some of the most advanced universities in the world outside Afghanistan. So they must have come to this understanding that that they cannot live with a transformed Afghanistan where if you commit any human rights violation or anything wrong, any misdeed, the whole world will be informed, because everybody, the young generation, man and woman, now use the mobile phones, they use the technology. If a woman is born 20 years back, now that woman is grown up with technology, with the new opportunities of the new world. And I do not think that anybody, any government will reverse that, that generation. So therefore, I think the strategy we have is, first of all, we are not going, there is no lose-lose. We hope we will go to negotiation with a win-win situation where the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the Taliban will agree on some of these most kind of challenging issues. And I think women's rights is one of that. I'm sorry if I'm taking more than 2 minutes, because I have already apologized that I have to leave, but I finished this statement. So one of the burning issue, or one of the top issue for negotiation, will be the matter of citizens' rights, not only specifically women's rights, but citizen rights. And I think the approach is that you cannot really disclose women's rights from every gains we have had. Women's rights is a matter of integrated issue to Islamic Republic, to the people's rights to participate in the future form of their government, to democracy, to elections, to freedom of speech, to freedom of movement, to everything that we have gained over the past 20 years. There is a component of women's rights. Now, how can you deny that component and still have democracy, still have people's participation, still have respect for women? That is not possible. So therefore, I think we have to really agree that we are living in a completely transformed Afghanistan. And I'm not speaking only about Kabul. There are people who will try to invalidate our cause, the women's rights cause, by saying that this demand is Kabul-centric. I'm speaking on behalf of the villages of Afghanistan, where women probably will not have the same outlook as I do, or my daughters do, but they definitely want their daughters to go to school. They definitely want their daughters to have a future. So therefore, I think any government, any power sharing arrangement should include the 55% of the society. And there is no, this is a logical demand. We're living in 21st century where Afghanistan is part of it. And if you look at other Muslim countries, some panelists were giving examples. If you look at the region, if you look at the neighboring countries, no country has had the experience of a woman of Afghanistan as we did have that experience during Taliban. So I hope we go to talks with, yes, we are flexible on behalf of this negotiation team, but in the meantime, there is a level to which we can be flexible on behalf of people of Afghanistan, on behalf of our constitution, on behalf of our institutions and state. And I think Taliban should understand that there is a limit we cannot cross, and there is a limit of patience also among the public, which we have to really respect.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Kofi, for those thoughtful comments. The next question is for Mr. Noor. We all know that hopefully you're still there. So we all know that the demographics of Afghanistan are very young. The median age in Afghanistan, I believe, is about 19 years old right now. Many of Afghanistan's young people were not around or have no memory of the years of Taliban rule. So you would be representing the youth demographic on the Intra-Afghan negotiating team. So what would you say Afghan youth are looking for in a potential political settlement with the Taliban? And what would be your main message to the Taliban in potential negotiations as a young Afghan? So Mr. Noor, the question is for you, and if you could keep your response to less than 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for your question. As you said, the population of Afghanistan is a very young population. More than 65% of the population is under 25. So I will be representing the majority of our population who have grown up in the new Afghanistan, post 9/11, with the rights and with our current constitution. So if I'm going to, whenever I go to the message that I will take to them is the message of the young, and that is our second chapter of our constitution, which includes human rights, the women's rights, the rights of minorities, freedom of expression, and also the gains that we have made in the last 19 years is something that I am hoping for the Taliban to understand that these gains will not be compromised easily, and this is not something that we can compromise at the negotiation. So a deal that I and my generation is looking for is a deal where there is human rights, where there is the values of the youth and the republic and our constitution is preserved. This is something that I'm looking for at any possible deal. This young people now, for example, there's one of the very important things that I can give an example is that today an Afghani man or woman, they can stand up and question the president of Afghanistan and ask a very, very hard question and challenge his policies without any fear of security-wise, any fear. So this is something that I, as a young man, as a representative of this country in New Afghanistan, will be preserving. This is one of the rights that we will be telling the Taliban that they cannot come with that.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Noor, for a very interesting response. So the next question is to Ambassador Kobia. You had mentioned in your comments the Taliban relationship with Al Qaeda, which is very critical because, as we know, the U.S. Taliban agreement compels the Taliban to very specifically sever ties with Al Qaeda. You mentioned it briefly. But there's been a lot of mixed messaging as to what exactly the relationship is between these two today. I mean, you'll recall that there was a UN report that came out a few weeks ago that indicated that the Taliban continues to cooperate with Al Qaeda, even though the U.S. government, including a recent Pentagon report, indicated that they are cooperating. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said no. In fact, the Taliban has turned against Al Qaeda. So what is your view or the EU's thinking on this relationship between the Taliban and Al Qaeda? Are there indications that the Taliban is indeed trying to move away from the group, or is that not the case?
Look, I think we have all read this very interesting UN report and many other reports that have been released over the last weeks and months about what the state of the links and the historical links have been between the different terrorist groups in Afghanistan and the way they have evolved. over time, because there has been quite a strong evolution. I'm sure certain organizations have more detailed information than we have on these links. So I'm relying on, the official reports like the ones of the UN and a number of reports that have also been written by eminent specialists. So with COVID, it's obviously not easy to go to the ground and have your own first-hand information for the time being. What I think is important to say is that, number one, the severing of ties between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is one of the major aspects of the Doha Agreement. So something needs to be happening there. So what the details are of their links today, and we know that the links exist at many different levels, economic, family, ideological, etc. But there needs to be some concrete evolution in these links if the Taliban want to abide by their part of the agreement. As I mentioned before, I think the US and the NATO forces have done quite a bit on withdrawing troops, on closing bases, etc., etc. Well, we still need to have more detailed information on what effectively has taken place since the Doha Agreement, since this commitment to severe links. So this is a call to the Taliban. I think they should inform in detail, at least those who are directly involved, about what has happened and what kind of evolution has taken place. The second thing is that I think at a certain stage communication is important, and the public perception of Afghans is important. They need to see that there is something that is moving. And with a number of terrorist attacks that have been taking place over the last weeks and months since Doha, and that have not been claimed by the Taliban, that have been sometimes even rejected by the Taliban, but we have seen quite little distanciation from these actions from the Taliban. On several occasions they have done so, but on many others they haven't. So I think this raises a question mark on what is the exact position of the Taliban leadership vis-a-vis the actions of these other terrorist groups. And the same is valid for Daesh and ISK and many others. So I think the proof is in the pudding, as the saying goes. And I think, one needs to have a little more information, a little more conviction that something is really happening on the ground, and that the links are, if not being severed, because we know that this takes time, it may take still a lot of time for this to be effectively implemented, but at least that action is being taken, that decisions are being made in order for the situation to change. It's not for any reason that this is such a prominent issue in the Doha Agreement, that was the object of very intense, very long, very complex negotiations that even were on the verge of breaking because of that aspect. So I remain to be convinced that things are going this way. I hope they do, but more information would be very much welcome for me as well as for most of our listeners, I would assume. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to pose one question to each of their two remaining panelists, and then I will take a few questions from the audience before we wrap up. And I apologize in advance that we can't get to every question. There are so many, and so many good ones too. Question for Dr. Barfield. For the duration of the war, or for the duration of the US-led war, US policymakers have often been criticized for not properly understanding the complexities of Afghanistan in terms of its culture, its society, its politics. So speaking as a US academic expert on Afghanistan, what would you say are some of the key realities about Afghanistan that Washington and US officials should be mindful of as they work with Kabul and other actors to launch an intra-Afghan dialogue?
I believe the first thing they should understand is that outcome is more important than process, is that we focused on elections as if they're democracy, and Afghans have seen elections as a tryout, and then what do the leaders do? I also believe there's a tendency in America and the West in general to think of Afghans as a uniform group, when in fact it's an incredibly diverse country. And very often when they say we've had the Afghan point of view, sometimes that's been their interlocutors in Kabul. And then they've been taken by surprise that that's not necessarily representative. That's true in many countries, and it's certainly been true in the United States. It seems to me that if the Americans had looked at their own country and realized how different their states are, and you can look at that right now, that Massachusetts and Mississippi are part of the same country, but they appear to be very different people, that they should take that in mind in dealing with Afghanistan.
Well, thank you for that short but sweet and very useful response. Appreciate it. So now a question to Dr. Barakat. You recently announced the formation of a new forum. I believe it's a forum of Afghan thinkers, all of whom are interested in Afghanistan, and you know, it seems like a very interesting and encouraging initiative. And you had said on Twitter that you think that this can promote sustained pathways to peace. Could you briefly, not more than 2 minutes, talk a little bit about this forum and how you think this could contribute to sustained peace in Afghanistan?
Sultan, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, apologize for that. The idea of the forum is very much linked to what I was saying earlier, that there is a need to go into the substantive aspects of what the day after an agreement would look like. At the moment, everybody seems to be focused on capturing power, sharing power, getting into power. But if you were to push colleagues to say, well, what would it look like? You are, you get nothing. And it maybe applies more to one side than the other, is that there is a policy vacuum on a lot of issues. Fawzia very articulately talked about the needs for women. Now, is there a policy on the Taliban side to say, well, if we are in politics, this is how we're going to do it? It needs to be articulated, needs to be written, needs to be debated, and so on. And the same, I think, if you talk to the other side, there are a lot of issues that are missing. The constitution, the way it's going to develop, the way it's going to preserve its Islamic identity while opening up for democratic representation, different roles in society, simple things like taxation. What would the country live on if the United States decides to pull out altogether? What will the country live on if the EU does not like the outcome, what they negotiate, and decide there's no aid for Afghanistan coming from the EU? Where will this come from? So a lot of these ideas have not really been tackled. And we believe that tackling those by Afghans only, if you notice, the forum has no non-Afghan people in it. It's all what we do at the center here is we facilitate its presence. We are supporting them coming together, but it's going to be shared by them. It's going to be the agenda set up by them. The debates are their debates. We may be providing support in terms of research and hopefully maybe support to write up reports and so on. But it is very much people from Afghanistan talking and thinking about Afghanistan and its future and digging deep into some of those details, which could help remove obstacles. For example, had we had a discussion around the release of prisoners in a substantive way, someone would have tackled the issue of demobilization of those prisoners. The fact that they needed to be received honorably by their families. How do you receive them? Where do they go next day? The fact that they should be offered the alternatives for livelihood and so on to ensure that they don't return to violence and many, many other aspects. All of these need to be debated. And we're hoping that this forum, which is independent, individuals in it may be close to certain political view in some way or the other, but we don't expect them to be associated publicly with their politics. We are interested only in them debating those ideas and then publicizing them and then putting them out in the public domain to be hopefully engaged with the wider Afghan society, particularly the youth and women groups and many other groups that have developed over the last 20 years or so.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Barakat. Really interesting and encouraging initiative. So I'm going to pose 3 questions from the audience. And again, time flies. I'm sorry we can't ask more. The first one is, I think, an appropriate question to pose, given that we have a British organization that organized this event. This is a question for anyone that would like to respond on the panel. How can the UK government help get the Afghan diaspora engaged in all Afghan matters, concluding peace? Does anyone want to take a crack at that?
Yes, I would like to comment on that.
Please, go ahead.
Me. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's a very important question. We have this massive diaspora living outside with lots of capability and capacity and knowledge to contribute to the Afghanistan peace and development. The Afghan government is trying to reach out to those people around the world. But yes, I think we still lack expertise on very important development plans and strategies in which we can go to a self-reliance. We are still dependent heavily on the international assistance, but in the next, as we look into our new draft economic and development plan for the next 5 years, the Afghan government is planning to involve diaspora. So UK can help us to mobilize those talents and Afghans who are living in UK with specific expertise in economic and development and energy sector and environmental, that they can somehow be encouraged to help the Afghan government, the Afghan people, implement the next 5 years plan in which it carries a very clear development objectives. So that will be one of the area in which the UK can help us to have a meaningful relationship and communications with this diaspora that will help us a lot. Thank you.
Great. Well, let's go on to the second of the 3 questions I'll pose, and it relates to the issue of legitimacy. And the question goes as follows. Pardon me. The Afghan Republic has had certain legitimacy advantages over the Taliban by virtue of democratic elections. However, the most recent presidential election saw only 1.8 million valid votes. How does this much reduced citizen participation affect negotiations with the Taliban? Anyone like to address that?
I think I'll go if Mrs. Siddiqui is okay.
After you, sir. After you, Mr. Noor. After you, just one moment, I will comment.
Please say a couple of minutes. Listen, Michael. The idea of having an election is what matters. And in our constitution, there is nothing that has said that there is no limit for the participation of voters and in our election. So it is the idea to hold election. And about the question whether it will affect the negotiation or not, I think I can say that no, it will not affect us. It will not affect the Republic because we are a legitimate government. With all the problems that we are facing and issues and challenges, the good thing that we have is that there is an acceptance that we accept the diversity that we have, and now we also have this agreement between both candidates. And the consensus in the country is what matters the most.
Mr. Siddiqui, did you want to add something?
Yes, sir, if you allow me to, just a quick comment on
Please.
that. Yes, we did have a very difficult election, and the reasons were obvious. For the first time, our elections were threatened directly by the Taliban. People were threatened not to participate in the election. But as Mr. Noor said, I totally agree with him. There's no constitutional order to have, or to tell us the number of the participants, the voters. But again, after the election, what happened was we all together, all the parties, everybody shaped a very strong political and national consensus in order to go and enter the peace process. So today, even if the question lies on the legitimacy of the outcome of the elections, but then we have a very strong political consensus. At the government level, there's a participation, there's a partnership 50-50 with all the other political parties. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Final word?
Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, just a small word, if I may, on the elections. Fully agree with the two previous speakers. Yeah, the short points I wanted to make is that we should also remember, besides what has been said, that there have been reasons why the voters did not go in big numbers to vote in these elections. We don't have time here to go through all the reasons, but one way to look at it is to say, well, not that many voters went to vote. I prefer to look at it in another way and to pay tribute to all those Afghans who, at the risk of their lives, went out to vote. I wonder how many of us in the international community would take the risk of our lives to go and cast a ballot. And with the threats, intimidations that have taken place before the elections, I think this is a great achievement. So I'm not saying the elections were perfect. It is true that there has been some disappointment in the numbers, but there are many reasons for that. And I think we should not forget that. And my second point is more a question of principle. It's not because there's a shortcoming in one event that the principle is damaged. I think the constitution is clear on the election. It needed to be upheld because we are in a difficult moment for Afghanistan where the constitutional framework needs to be reaffirmed. So if the decision had been made not to hold the elections, well, that was, another nail in the coffin of the constitution. And I think this was not the right way to go. The constitution, just like all constitution in this beautiful world, is not perfect either, but it should be kept as much as possible. So in all democracies, we have bad elections. And some of us here on the call belong to countries where there have been imperfect, suboptimal elections, and notably in my own country. So it is not because an election was not successful that we should draw the conclusion that the principle of the election, trying to help Afghanistan gradually building democracy, should be taken away and should be changed. Over. Thank you.
Can I also comment on this?
Yes, please do.
Well, I think in terms of the peace process, as many of us would know, there were calls to postpone the elections in order to allow the peace talks to progress at some stage and so on. But in many ways, it's good that it wasn't postponed. And I think the fact that it has gone the way it did, it was imperfect. There were a lot of problems. Even the results were contested, and they were contested badly. And as you rightly say, it would have affected the legitimacy of the state. But the Afghan president and Mr. Abdullah managed to find a way out of this. And to their credit, I think it is now this peace process that allowed them the way out, in that Mr. Abdullah is now leading on the peace process. And that's a very important job. It's a future focused job and responsibility. And no matter how difficult the process has been, they found a way to sort it out. And for us in the international community should just support that. The real issue of legitimacy is really the question is, when our activities start to lend false legitimacy to one side, which will then lead to more complications in the peace process. And I think the process so far has suffered a lot from that kind of legitimacy being lent to one side at the expense of the other. And in the case of the Taliban, really, it has given a lot of mileage to the idea that they could become a state when even they probably know that they can't become a state. So I think we have to be very careful with these issues. The way we communicate with the parties is important. The way they are allowed to have political representation is important. From that perspective, I think the fact that the government has now agreed to meet with the Taliban in Doha is probably to their advantage in many ways, because they are meeting with a group in its place of refuge. This is a temporary place given to them. This is not an equal state to negotiate with, and so on. So these issues have got to be developed in greater capacity for the issue of legitimacy to ultimately emerge where there is an all-inclusive system for Afghanistan.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Barakat, and thank you all to all the panelists for those very interesting responses. Unfortunately, we will need to wrap up now. We're over time, so I will in just a moment turn things over to Shabnam. Just wanted to thank all of the panelists. Really terrific discussion. Yeah, I think we can agree that when it comes to the peace process in recent months, it seems like it's one step forward, two steps back. But I want to end on a glass half full note and indicate that we should really build on that one step forward that continues to be made even after you have the two steps back. And so, let's hope that the coming days and weeks will bring some good news on that front. So with that, thank you. And I turn things over to Shabnam, who will give a concluding note.
Thank you so much, Michael, for wonderfully chairing the Q&A part of this event. From what we've spoken about peace, it seems like, and what I've understood is peace needs to be at the center of the intra-Afghan dialogues. Until we understand that Afghans have paid a heavy price over the past 40 years and will continue to do so, we will not realize that Afghans cannot be a bargaining chip to any sort of political games between leaders and different groups. And so I hope that these sort of discussions continue. And one of the key ambitions that we've had with holding this forum was that we want to ensure that Afghanistan and the challenges that Afghanistan faces continues to be on Western and international radars. I completely understand that COVID-19 and the impact of coronavirus has meant that the rest of the world is completely busy, understandably, with their own sort of challenges and their economies. But what's going on the ground, whether it's poverty, whether it's the daily attacks that kill hundreds across the country, and the delay in the intra-Afghan dialogue, it needs to have the attention and the support of the international community. I think on its own, the fear is very much so that it will continue and lead to a stage where instability will return. So thank you so much to everyone who was able to participate. I'm afraid, like Michael said, we've run out of time. There were so many more questions that the audience have been able to put forward, but I hope that from our discussions, some of those were already answered. And thank you to the wonderful guests that were able to join us from Afghanistan. I know internet connections aren't great, but for the effort and the time, we're very grateful. And I think it's been a very rich discussion, highlighting both the challenges and the opportunities. And I guess I'd like to end by wishing our guests from Afghanistan every success to bring an end to over 4 decades of war. And I do hope that, as one of the questions quite very clearly laid out, that Afghans from around the world who are dedicated to be able to support the peace process also find a way to get engaged and support the government and leaders back home. So thank you again, and hopefully we can continue this in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks.